Well, good morning. I'm just going to talk about how AI has transformed the way I learn as a self-directed learner. Right, I'm an autodidact. I've taught most of the stuff that I talk about in these podcasts. I taught most of it myself. I have taken courses, but that was after I already began learning about the subject. Right, Buddhism, the Bhagavad Gita, that sort of stuff. I've taken courses on, but I just want to talk about AI. So a few years ago, I was lucky enough to test out, I think it was Chat GPT 2 or 2.5, something like that. Tested it again at 3, and I think at 3.5. I think that was the last time I tested it. Then 4 came out, and somebody tried it for me, and it came out quite a bit better. And so recently I've been playing with Chat GPT 4.0. I don't know if it's a 0 or an O. But long story short, when I first tried it, what I was offered or asked to test out a Nietzsche persona, and I laughed because in our BookTube group, I mentioned how you can have an author's personality as your avatar. And they said, no, you can't. And I find this funny. Like, I mean, these are people as old as me or older than me. They have no idea that I've been using these AI apps for years now. Plus, again, they're talking about the default assistant that is available for free through ChatGPT. They're not talking about what ChatGPT has been able to accomplish and what they've put together. I talked about this years ago when I first tried the Nietzsche bot, because I talked about how I really wish there was a Carl Jung bot. But I also mentioned that I think that wouldn't happen because so much of his stuff is still under copyright, and I mean, his family is holding on to this stuff so tight. In fact, I think they have done a major disservice to the world, period, by keeping his stuff under wraps for so long. The example I give is his Red Book. It wasn't published till 2009. That's horrible. That's 50 plus years of help it could have given to not just individuals, but could have informed psychologists. Because as I've told you, polyvagal theory, internal family systems, all of these protocols are heavily influenced by Carl Jung. And I'm going to get to that because that's what happened this morning. It just boggles my mind what a bunch of horrible people most people are, right? So I'll mention my first experiences with AI. So I could tell that the Nietzsche bot was, at most, it was pretty close to seeming like a person, but at most it seemed like what I run across on Discord, people that barely understand Nietzsche. So it was pretty bad. And I asked it all sorts of questions, both simple and hard. It barely got there on most of them. It got the fairly simple questions. But as I said, it wasn't until ChatGPT 4 that it started answering questions that I think was up to snuff to a Nietzsche scholar. It certainly does not sound like Nietzsche, right? And at the time, I also tried, I told you before, I tried machine translation to translate somebody's French book on Buddhism, and it failed utterly. But that's fairly simple, English to French, right? Same for ChatGPT. It's a large language model based on English, right? So translation from English to a fairly simple language like French, I mean simple to translate, transpose from English to French. But something like Chinese. So I tried translating Chinese. It's actually a Zen Sutra that has never been translated from the Chinese. And I ended up having to do almost all of the translation myself. It got maybe 4 or 5 characters out of 10 or 12. But fast forward to now, ChatGPT 4.0. So I ran as a first test. One of the first tests is I ran that Zen Sutra through, I don't know, how would you say it, through the algorithm. And wow, it's 1,000% better. So much better. In fact, now I only need to change or adjust maybe a couple characters per line. The odd line may need a little change in context. But overall, fantastic job. And just in a matter of a couple years. But here's what's the problem. Is the only way that you know ChatGPT has done a good job is if you know the answer already. So I'll give you an example. I've been feeding some of my philosophical ideas, some of my crazier ideas about philosophy, theology, religion, meaning, healing, trauma, you name it, as well as scholarship surrounding different subjects, right? So I put in different things. So one example is this meta-modernism. I mention it because meta-modernism is becoming very popular. They're talking about it, but they're basing it on the understanding of what it is based on some children wrote an essay maybe 10 years ago or so. But they're not understanding what metamodernism really is. Very infrequently, I'd love if you find someone who talks about it properly, point me to it. But this idea that we can blend modernity and postmodernity, and meta-modernity was what was supposed to be the next stage. So I asked ChatGPT, I'm like, hey, Nietzsche, do you agree or disagree? Nietzsche was the founder or the original progenitor of this idea of metamodernism. I can't remember the exact words, but like he was the founder or whatever. I should have said the inspiration, then they would have agreed probably immediately. But what ended up happening is the ChatGPT said, well, we agree, right? The foundation of metamodernism came from Nietzsche's ideals of how we could find this balance, transvaluation of all values, but at the same time, not throwing out the old if it's serving us, but also transvaluation. So if we are holding some truths to be self-evident, but we're not living them, well, there's a solution too, which I'll get to. I put that through ChatGPT as well. But ChatGPT said, no, we agree with reservation. And you know what the reservation was? It doesn't understand metamodernism, right? So I went back and said, well, wait a minute. Your issues don't, you didn't make your case, right? So it said, we agree, but with reservations. Its only reservation is Nietzsche never said the word metamodern. Okay. So I just went back and said, but hey, that doesn't support your position, right? What I'm talking about is he the founder or the creator or the inspiration for this idea, right? So call it proto-metamodernism. And then it's, oh, absolutely, absolutely, blah, blah. So ChatGPT 100% agreed that this idea, but again, it gets more complicated because I also put a comment I put on YouTube about William James and Jung and this idea of meaning and a religious view in life, right? And this all relates. It's funny. And ChatGPT, not only did it say, oh, absolutely, you're right about all of these, but that's a wonderful, excellent way. I can't remember the exact words, but it said it was wonderful outlining how William James and Jung and all these Nietzsche and how all these people come together, right? But so today, here's what becomes interesting. So today I was just in a chat room, and these are just nobodies, right? That's literally what the room is called. But the host is by himself, just bored, looking for something to do. And they were talking about AA, and I just dropped the idea that Carl Jung inspired AA, and I guess he misunderstood. I mean, how much can you put in a chat? I mentioned about the letter, and now he only thought of one letter, right? He only thought about one letter. And he proceeded to go on a long diatribe about how it's wrong and Jung didn't. But again, I love AI because what he doesn't realize is, well, first of all, you don't have to believe the guy who's read everything Jung's ever written, and it's mentioned in a number of the books and the intros. But there's also a history of AA, also mention it. And believe it or not, it's even in Dale Carnegie's book where he talks about this too. So, I mean, this is not something that's hard to come across. But imagine someone who's talking about AA and the foundation of AA, and they don't understand any of this. But so I just asked AA. I said, well, Carl Jung's influence on AA. Absolutely. The foundation of, right? Because they were just, this Oxford group was trying to figure out how to heal. And Carl Jung had a patient called Roland H. And Roland H. Had a remission back to alcoholism. And so this is the letter I'm talking about. He misunderstood what I was getting at. because what I did is after he said I wasn't correct, I posted just the header to the 1961 letter that Carl Jung sent, where he was saying to Bill, "Thank you for thanking me for the inspiration for the 12 steps and the actual spiritual aspects of AA." So yes, this host, this random individual, was right that Carl Jung did not inspire Alcoholics Anonymous itself, because just like the NAACP, it was originally inspired by another group, the Niagara Movement. So it was the Oxford group that inspired the AA. And what everyone loves about Alcoholics Anonymous was 100% inspired by Jung. So if you'd actually read it and go, well, it's the letter, but absolutely, Carl Jung inspired Alcoholics Anonymous. There's no two ways about it. And I love that I don't even have to bother running to all of those different sources to show, well, Carl Jung mentioned it here, and it was mentioned by his editor in this introduction. It's mentioned in this biography of Jung, and it's mentioned in Dale Carnegie's book, and it's mentioned in, a history of the AA. I don't have to, because I love it that AI pulls all that stuff up for me. And so I did an even deeper dive, and it goes even deeper. And as this guy was going off about, it happened in 1930, it goes all the way back to 1935. That Alcoholics Anonymous, not trying to get people sober. No, that was begun before Jung was involved. But Alcoholics Anonymous itself, the 12-step program, the spiritual component of the healing, came directly from the inspiration of Carl Gustav Jung. But how do you get this stuff across to people? It's impossible, because I'll give you another example. Yesterday, I was in a chat room and practicing my French, and we were just talking about words, language, and I mentioned how equanimité in French is not well translated in English, even though we use it, equanimity. I mentioned about in search of lost time, right? La recherche, à la recherche, the research rather than the search, and de temps perdu, of time lost, no, of time misplaced, of time overlooked, of time, it has multiple meanings. And so this is what we're talking about, that it's so hard to translate with single words into English. And this one person, a French native, said that, there's this word that I came across. And so we ended up having to wait for them to find the word. They finally found the word, and it was dépaiement, I think is exactly what it was. And they said, well, this is impossible to translate into English, And here's an example, because I tried to explain to them that, no, that was actually just a failure of fluency versus literacy, right? So I'm literate in French. My fluency, I'm starting to think it's better than I give myself credit for, because when she said the word, I'm not familiar with it. It's really, as she says, it's rare and it's an old word. But right away, I'm like, you're de-countryed? But I guessed discombobulated. Discombobulated. Now, very obscure English word, sure. Disorientation would be a more common word. And the young person, or whoever they were, I say young because I'm so old, everyone else must be young. But this person said, no, that's not right, because it's also being out of your country. Well, that's what I said, right? Decountryed was my first guess, just kidding around. Well, I said that would be abroad, right? But what this person doesn't understand is no word, and I already explained this earlier when we were talking about this, no word has a single translation, right? As I said, with vicissitudes, here's what's interesting. AI has already begun to help with that. I've told you for years, vicissitudes was defined as the unfavorable things that happen to us in life. Now they've updated it. It's now updated as both. It's both the good and the bad. That used to be my small little claim to fame, to show that I understood English better than even than the dictionaries online. But it was just a failure of the dictionaries, it seems. Right? So they've updated that definition. But lo and behold, it ended up that this person just wouldn't want to admit that, okay, well, this word here does have a translation, so let me find another. But they didn't. They just went on, and it ended up the room were just attacking them. And it ended up there was close to 10 sources saying, well, no, this is a fairly easy to translate concept or word into English. But they just didn't want to admit that, oh, no, because they're right. It's not easily translated into English. There isn't a single word. But that's a failure of someone, and I tried to explain this, the difference between translation and interpretation. Right? We've ran into this with Friedrich Nietzsche. Right? As I said, Kaufman will translate Schatzen as or Schatzen, the word that Nietzsche uses, meaning that worthy arbitrator of meaning, of value. Kaufman will say he's estimator, and R.J. Hollingdale calls it evaluator. They're both correct, but that's your interpretation. You're interpreting the meaning, right? Translation is arguably impossible in this sense because the word has a dozen different meanings. And the reason why it's impossible in this case is you could interpret to get an idea of which sense was meant. But when it comes to Nietzsche, he meant all of the senses, pretty much, multiple senses. This is why I say I need to be doing a skeleton key for Zarathustra, because I don't think people realize you don't just need to know German. You need to know High German and so much more. You need Hebrew and Latin. It is so difficult to be able to understand and translate Nietzsche properly. Right, so there's another example. See, I've run into this so often. Just the other day, I mentioned someone was stuck, right? Kind of like they're all wet or they're stuck in the mud. And I remember a French expression, démouillé, right? So all wet, right? Or you're moist or you're humid. But it goes deeper than that. It even means to be moored. And then imagine me trying to explain, and it was a perfect example because when I translated the English to the French, it lost all of that context. Because no, there is not a French word for moor, but there is anchor, right? And what was really confusing to the French person was that the word moor, to be moored, means to be tied to a dock. But the dock is also the moor. But so is the rope. It's incredibly confusing, but it's contextual. But more so, it requires you to be kind of like why I love E.E. Cummings' poetry. You're required to be the author. So you have to wake up and pay attention, right? And figure out what is its meaning? What is the context? Oh, I'm just a mess today, I gotta tell you. But so that was the last couple of days. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It really is. Right? What do you do though? Like I just left that chat room when he's going off and on with the history because what am I going to do? He's live talking into the computer and the camera. How am I supposed to convince him in chat that no, I may have made my 5 words not terribly clear, but you're not correct in any way. Jung absolutely inspired Alcoholics Anonymous. And so what do you do? Right? Like we ended up having to just give up on our chat in the French chat room as well, because the person just didn't want to give up on this idea that no, that's not right. It's not translatable. There was, a dozen people in the room and there was almost as many translations put forward from different sources, right? Larousse, a couple of different AIs, a couple of different machine translators, dictionaries, search engines. But none of that mattered to the person because they had it in their mind that this word was untranslatable. Right? Same as, I guess, the young man who himself is struggling with his alcoholism, didn't realize that maybe he needs to educate himself a little better. Right? What I was trying to get across was exactly that. That quote that I keep bandying about, that Jung realized early in his career that his patients were healed, particularly from some sort of what he called an unattributable malaise. I call it the modern malaise. Charles Taylor agrees. He calls it the malaise of modernity. He found that all of his patients were healed if they adopted a religious view of life, right? Sacred versus profane, right? See your body as a temple. See others as worthy. And biggest thing, and I know I'm pedantic about this, but it's when Jesus was asked about the ultimate commandment. He said, yes, love God with all of your heart, your body, your mind, and your soul, your strength, depending on the translation. But he follows up with to love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And I've said this for a long time. This is something that Jung could have mentioned because I think this is the missing piece today. The missing piece is that we don't love ourselves. We really don't. We are so self-hating, self-loathing, right? Because think about it. On what planet, when someone is in your chat room chatting with you, on what planet do you think that they're being malevolent? Right? On what planet do you not bother asking, hey, what do you mean by that? What's some more complex? Well, I could have given more context and said, well, it goes back to the early 30s as he went pedantically telling his remembered version of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. Right? But where's he getting it? Maybe Wikipedia, as I said, a terrible source for knowledge nowadays because of how failing it really is. But what is the takeaway then? Well, I mean, really, the takeaway is a lot of us excel at loving others. A lot of us excel at loving life, or what would you say? Loving the world. But so few of us have a love for our potential, for each other, and most importantly, for ourselves. And I think if we loved ourselves more, we would want to do better. Right? For me, being incredibly sick for so very long, I was just like them for a long time. But then I came to realize what a wonderful partner I have that stood by me for all this. And so I transformed that love into a love for myself, right? Because if I don't love myself and I don't take care of myself and I don't live for as long as possible, then I'm going to hurt the person that I love most and the person that stood by me for my whole life. This is from the 12 steps, this idea of making amends, right? And it's often misunderstood, like in the Dhammapada, the Buddhist, I guess you'd say the Buddhist Bible. It says, how better to cover an evil deed than with a good one? And that's just a really crappy translation. What it really means is, if you really are contrite, contrition, you have contrition for your transgressions, your mistakes, then you're not going to do bad deeds. You're going to continue to do good deeds after good deeds, right? Similar to Surah 4:125 in the Quran. Good deeds followed by good deeds and turning towards truth. Well, and that's the truth right there, right? If I keep quoting this sixth line of the Ishopanishad, the same ideas in the Bhagavad Gita, the same ideas as in the Yoga Sutra, but I like the sixth line of the Ishopanishad because it's so short and to the point, right? When you see your soul in other people and you see their soul in yours, That's truly understanding where we are and where we're going to go and freedom, whatever you want to do to translate that. But that's Carl Jung's individuation. It's what he called wholeness. And I love that because it would have been understood by Jung and Nietzsche that to be fully healed, I guess, essentially, right? Because there's different words in German for healed, but to be fully healed, completed, also means to be whole in German. Can't remember quite. Verling. It starts with a V, ends with UNG. I can't. Verling. Don't quote me on that. But it means to be whole. It means to be healed. And again, 12-step program. So as I've said, internal family systems, Alcoholics Anonymous, trauma-informed mindfulness, a lot of these protocols have just built on what came before. As Northrop Frye said, there is nothing new under the sun. Well, sorry, that's a quote from the Bible. But what Northrop Frye said is all knowledge, all information, all art, literature, poetry is like silt being laid down in a river. And new material builds upon the previous. You may not directly see the influence, but it is there below the surface, below the silt. As I said, I guess maybe Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't talk about how foundational an influence Carl Jung's philosophy and Jung himself had on the organization. But that's neither here nor there because, as I've said before, the most important thing, and this seems to be contrary to the whole idea, the most important thing that we need to hold is doubt, particularly in your own ideas. This is why I love AI, because I've always had a tremendous amount of doubt. But when you're a self-directed learner, well, that doesn't leave you much confidence, does you? Because you don't have anyone giving you confidence, right? So for me, y'all, the viewers and the feedback that I get, that's a big deal. But as you know, very few people reach out in the end, right? I can have thousands of viewers with only a couple of comments. But when it comes to AI, as I said, my thoughts on the synergy between Jung and James and Nietzsche's philosophy and the whole idea of Schatzen and Gestalt, all very well supported, not just by the AI, but with the supporting document. I'm not just asking the AI to say, yes, do you agree? No, I'm asking it to give me an essay that supports that position. And it does a pretty good job. And what I love about it is you can then tear down each little point separately and go through additional supports. You can actually have AI write you an essay just on the one aspect. Like, for example, with the AI and Carl Jung, I could have him just pull out this idea of a religious view of life and what he means by that, right? Seeing, yourself and everyone as sacred, right? So, continuing to abuse yourself or others, it works, right? So if you don't love yourself, then maybe you have compassion for others and you might do better for yourself for them. And as Swami Sarva Priyananda says, if you don't have faith in anything, yourself, in your path, well, practice with enough devotion and confidence. Practice, and faith will come. Faith will come. Doubt is a natural step towards learning, towards understanding. And what I'm finding is this AI is not going to replace us. It doesn't seem to have the potential. As I've said before, and I was made fun of by, this BookTube guy who calls himself a saint. He disagreed that AI won't replace us because I said, for one small reason, it lacks the creativity that we have. It's not a meta being like we are. I've talked about this before. I think we may create a large language model or something like that might create something that is much closer to independent. I won't say sentient, but closer to an independent and learning sort of system. But so my whole takeaway here is I cannot believe that we're not leveraging all of our resources, not just AI to help kids learn, I still don't understand why we aren't using audiobooks for our kids, especially now that we can feed a book that doesn't have an audiobook, like a textbook, into AI, and we can produce an audiobook. And I've talked to you about this before, that there's a few books that, like Northrop Frye, for example, that don't have an audiobook. And I find it incredibly frustrating, right? Because I can get through his book with excellent retention and comprehension in a matter of a few days. But reading the book would take me probably a week or 2 weeks to get the same level of comprehension and understanding. So if I'm like this, how many more are like that? And as I said, the leading researcher in reading said, and even she failed because her son was a dyslexic. And did she teach him how to learn and work around his limitations? No, she just told him to double and triple down on where he wasn't deficient, right? So he became an artist. Kind of like our prime minister, who became a drama teacher because he was told he couldn't do maths. Well, I'm sorry. Nobody really told me any of that. So I was already in an accounting program. So I had to learn how to do maths, right? It wasn't until we got into some of this ridiculous stuff that makes no sense that I just couldn't do it. I had to drop out of that. I think it was algebra, and maybe not algebra. It might have been. It doesn't matter. It was one of those advanced math classes that just make absolutely no sense, and that's usually the limits of a dyslexic when it comes to math. But in reality, as I said, the leading researcher in reading didn't help her son. She well knows that reading is a skill that we have to add on to us. We're not natural physical readers, but we are natural listeners and talkers. Right? So just as a final example, I'm like, why do we read to our kids? It's not because the kids are going to learn to read from listening, but it builds pathways in the brain. But most importantly, it gets them to love stories, mythos, ideas, words, language, and even just, quality time, imagination, experience even. So why don't we continue to read to our kids? Why don't we continue to have our kids read to each other and discuss what they read about? Why? Because you know what I run into? Anytime there's a discussion about education and the problems in education, the teachers get all upset. And it's what I've told you. Any teacher graduating today has been taught information that's at least 20 years old. So the teacher's already stale dated. So imagine if you're stale dated when you graduate, then you struggle for 10 or 15 years to start, getting paid and have a position that you're happy with, only to find out that they want to change the ethos, the entire, education protocol, or honestly, in this case, change it at all, even a little bit. They find it very threatening and fight. They're back, get their back up. When in reality, the teacher, if they really cared about teaching the students, they'd have a certain sense of doubt. Right? So as a final, the thing that I've realized is the most important thing we need to do to get anyone to learn is to get them engaged, get them to love the ideas, love the stories, love books, love audiobooks, love whatever it may be. Because as I said, for 20 plus years, they believed that there was the 4 different kinds of learning, right? Listening and doing, or you know what I mean? But that was wrong. That was just some guy from New Zealand who just made that up. In reality, the most important thing that defines if a student's going to learn is their engagement. They say mindfulness, but I'd rather say engagement. Why? Because if the child has some sort of difficulties, hearing, seeing, thinking, perception, whatever it may be, it will be more difficult for them to be engaged. So rather than waiting for speech versus written differences and being able to notice whether someone may or may not have a disability, you can notice almost right away with something like that. That would allow us to at least highlight who maybe needs a little more work, a little more help, a little more guidance. Maybe they need to, you know, be helped to learn for themselves. But I don't know. I digress. We'll leave it at that. Have a lovely day.